What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be talking to you about systems thinking and complex problem solving, just my thoughts and my takes on how I'm actively solving using systems thinking through complex problems and how I'm actively just thinking about things and building things around systems thinking. So the mission with these videos is to show my builds raw and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that we're actively implementing in terms of frameworks and mental models, where we're failing, where we're succeeding, also just to document raw and authentic, to show you what it is that we're doing on a day-to-day basis and to solve where it hurts. So basically coming into businesses and organizations and basically being the chief problem solver by crafting custom solutions and ultimately allowing them to scale from that. And also just to call in visionaries, basically people that understand what our mission is, that are aligned with what it is that we're actively solving for, and also just to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So today I thought I'd do it a little bit different, just structuring it a little bit different just to see how it works. So what this really is about, it's not just about code, it's how I think, it's how I see the world. So basically seeing the world through systems thinking, I think, is a mental model slash framework that ultimately unlocks a deeper level of seeing things and ultimately just understanding things from the first principles basis. And I think for me personally, I like to think of systems thinking and first principles as one intertwined thing, and also just think of it as one concept, saying, hey, systems thinking ultimately allows you to say, hey, I see systems in everyday processes and things, to say, hey, you have a heart, your heart has complex systems, you have nerves, those nerves ultimately have systems within it. So then by asking first principles questions, of asking what is at the root of these systems, and ultimately reasoning up from there to say, hey, XYZ system starts from this specific point, and then we ultimately reason up from there, because my thoughts on this are specifically saying, hey, you cannot solve or build a system if you don't understand it from its core fundamentals. Basically using first principles and incorporating that and asking questions that ultimately unlock a deeper level of understanding, I think is super important, whether you're building something or you're already just integrating new things into what it is that you're building, or just, in your everyday life. I think this is super important, and that's why Killer Chaos OS wasn't built from a template. So for me, I want to make sure that we're ultimately just building from first principles, and that we're actually understanding where in the system where we can build from scratch, basically from the beginning, and then reason up from there, and then saying, hey, it was born from systems thinking and complex problem solving, because I think systems thinking basically ultimately allows you to then solve problems that are complex, and then saying, hey, I'm building software that sees chaos before it happens. So basically predictive analysis tools that we're going to be launching fairly soon, just sorting out a couple things and just integrating and just testing that out, and saying that adapts, that integrates, and that scales. So basically scaling within the business, basically on the back end, making sure that what it is that we're actively building make sure that we're actually providing value and it integrates well with the current processes, and if so, how do we then go about integrating it? And then saying, hey, that serves 500k plus luxury planners now. So ultimately our ICP right now, who we're working with, and saying, hey, soon we'll enter different verticals. We'll ultimately just work with different industries, basically just building different industries. But ultimately right now, we just want to super dial it in for our current ICP, making sure that we're perfecting it as much as possible, and saying, hey, I'm 22, I'm from Africa, no shortcuts, no fluff, just solving deep problems in real time, ultimately just taking the approach of saying, hey, we are starting from here, like no shortcuts, we're going to take the long way, we're in it for the long game, and ultimately that means we're going to fail a lot, and we're ultimately going to learn a lot as well. And ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that each and every single day we're just attacking and solving problems from its root. But how are you going to be able to solve problems from its root is how I actively just make sure that I'm incorporating first principles thinking and also systems thinking, because systems thinking is one of the most important tools that I have come across in order to think of saying, hey, I need to make sure that I understand the system at its core fundamental before I reason up from there, or even just build it out. That means mapping it out, understanding from the first principles, and asking questions that ultimately unlock that level of awareness that ultimately allows us to build the best possible solution. Also just making sure that we understand each and every single part, so that we understand that, hey, when we're building this out, we know how the system reacts, because how do you expect to understand how the system reacts if you don't understand it from its core, or you just understand it from a surface level. And understanding it from a surface level, when it does change over time, you're not going to understand where to tweak if it does fail. So ultimately just saying, hey, I need to couple systems thinking and first principles and ultimately use those tools to ultimately then solve deep complex problems. And I think this is super important, and that's why today I've decided to do it a little bit different, breaking it up into three parts, which number one is thinking in systems. Everything is connected, which I just mentioned, to say, hey, every single moving part that has a system or a process is connected. And why this matters is if you build without systems thinking, you're basically tapping wires together. You basically just tapping wires and just putting them together, not fully understanding how these wires actually function and how these complex systems within everyday life actually work. So saying, hey, a government is a system, people, communities are systems, and those are independent parts that ultimately function together. And how do you expect to understand that if you don't understand how they work from the core? Saying, hey, I need to understand economics because I need to know that how businesses and organizations and governments spend money and all those kinds of things, but you need to understand that from a first principles and systems thinking basis, to say, hey, each and every single moving part is connected, and asking the question, how are they connected, and then solving questions, and then just asking deep meaningful questions through that ultimately unlocks that level of awareness that then allows you to say, hey, if XYZ system reacts like this now because of the foundations and the way that it was built, and from my understanding, I know that into the future it's most likely going to react like this. And if there's another variable that may come into play, we also need to take that into account. And then saying, hey, systems thinking is zoning out, basically taking a lens and then basically zoning out and looking at the big picture and saying, hey, seeing how every part hits each other, basically understanding each and every single moving part for us, what we're building, seeing how the different dashboards, how that communicates with the code, and also just seeing how that communicates as well with the database, making sure that each and every single part we have it on lock, and that we ultimately just understand how to basically build it up and also make it modular as well, so that we understand that, hey, this part is modular. If it breaks, it breaks on that standalone part, and it's not super dependent on every single thing as well. But ultimately understanding that even though it's not super dependent, it ultimately is intertwined as well. So if it does break, it's also just not super dependent. It doesn't break the entire thing, but it's also a function of every single thing within the system. And then saying, hey, my move that I actively do is I mapped out a full planner's experience before I touched a single line of code. So making sure that we're dialing in through just making sure that we're mapping out what it is that we actively need to build. Because one of the things that I've learned especially is ultimately saying planning is the number one thing, especially if you're building something complex. Saying, hey, we need to make sure that each and every single part that we do, we make documents and SOPs and frameworks and all those things for planning. Because one of the things that you need to make sure that you have on lock is planning, because failure to plan is preparing to fail. I think that's how the saying goes. But yeah, anyways, so basically failure to plan, you basically failing. And ultimately we don't want to fail. We want to make sure that planning, even though it might take a bit of time, that we're just making sure that we have each and every single moving part on lock, so that when we're building it out from there, that we're actively taking that into consideration, because we have every single or most variables mapped out and planned, and just saying, hey, we have every single thing on lock, and we making sure that when we're building out, we're doing it right from the get-go. Because one of the things that I've done personally, especially when I was starting out, was saying, hey, we planned certain things, but we didn't take into account the different variable factors that may come into play, and ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we're actively building and solving for that. And saying, hey, bookings, deposits, alerts, filmer syncs, timeline stress, those all need to be on lock, making sure that we're planning each and every single move within the system, making sure that the workflows, how they actually interact with each other is also on lock. Because if we don't understand how they interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, then we're not going to know how to reason up from there. And just thinking in systems of asking, hey, if booking XYZ works in XYZ ways, then deposits should work in XYZ ways, which ultimately then sends an alert. But how does that alert then communicate with the bookings? And how does those alerts then communicate with the filmer sinks. Ultimately, just understanding that each and every single moving part, as much as it's independent, it's all a function of the system, and thinking that, saying, hey, and also realizing that and saying each function of the system ultimately interacts with each other, but we also need to understand how each and every single moving part works, because if one aspect of it breaks, then we need to know where to basically isolate the threat and then just solve for that specific threat in that specific isolated part of the system. But we need to understand the whole before we just dive in and say, hey, we are understanding at surface level, we need to solve XYZ. We just need to understand it from a root fundamental and ultimately just build up from there. And saying, hey, build workflows to talk to each other. So basically build these workflows to talk to each other, not just in isolation, making sure that each and every single moving part that we're building just for scale, and ultimately saying, hey, the lesson is, if you don't see the system, you'll never fix the chaos. Ultimately saying, if you don't see the entire system, you'll never be able to fix the chaos, because you simply just don't understand each and every single moving part, which ultimately is a problem. If you don't understand each and every single moving part in order to solve the chaos, which in order to solve chaos, you ultimately just need to understand every single moving part from the beginning, and saying, hey, a move that you can make, this is something I'm incorporating now just to give you guys a bit of tips that I actively use specifically for you guys. Saying a move that you can make, you can pick any part of your operations, simply like follow-ups. You can ask, what are the other parts that affect it if it breaks, and then ultimately applying systems thinking to say, hey, we have XYZ, saying booking, and what are the other parts that affect it if it breaks, and then ultimately incorporating systems thinking to say each and every single independent part is a function of the greater system, and all of those other moving parts ultimately are connected to that. And ultimately understanding that if something breaks, then there are other things that are dependent and related to that ultimately need to be taken into consideration when you're building a solution as well. And then ultimately just saying, hey, we need to basically be able to solve for dependencies, which I just touched on right now. And why this is important is complex problems aren't linear, they're webs. So basically saying, hey, you're not going to get XYZ results just by plugging in XYZ and then saying, hey, we expected to get that. As more complex, the more complexity that comes, the more webs or the more formation of different independent parts that you need to understand becomes. Basically saying it's not just surface, we just need to make sure that we understand the dependencies, because dependencies are super important in understanding the relationships that different functions have within the system, and ultimately understanding that the more the system scales, the more complex it gets, and the more webs that are formed. It's not just a linear process most of the time, especially if you're running a complex system. You're not just going to get a linear output or a linear web of system of functions to say, hey, XYZ does this, so hence why we're going to get XYZ, simply because it's not just surface. We need to make sure that we understand each and every single moving part by saying, hey, one weak integration, one laggy webhook, it's breaks the flow. Ultimately saying that, hey, if one part is lagging, it basically breaks the flow, and we need to make sure that we understand the dependencies that are reliant on that flow in order to build our solution. And saying, hey, my move, what I actively do is we had a lag in the planner notifications. Instead of tweaking the front end, I traced it back to slow API response and then basically fixed it at its source, basically saying, hey, we understand that XYZ problem is here. Okay, what are the questions that we need to ask, since we understand it from a systems perspective, to say, hey, each and every single moving part is dependent on each other, and then ultimately understanding that, hey, if XYZ is reacting in this way, then why don't we test XYZ, which is the API response, and seeing how it basically works, and then ultimately solving for that, but at its source. And ultimately just saying that we need to understand from its root perspective, or this root area, and then ultimately just build up from there, because if we understand the whole entire system, we can then build solutions around that. And saying, hey, now the system pings 3x faster. That's the difference between chaos and control. Basically just having chaos sorry, basically just having control over chaos, ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we have control over what it is that we're doing, and that we're actively fixing things and breaking things as well, and ultimately understanding that, hey, this is the break point as well, and we need to make sure that although this is the break point, we understand the entire system, and it's all, and also its dependencies, and ultimately just build a solution around that, and saying, hey, what's the lesson? Surface problems are just symptoms. Real ones live deeper. Saying, hey, each and every lesson that you have ultimately means that we need to make sure that the systems or the surface level problems that we have are simply just symptoms, and ultimately just understanding that, hey, it's much deeper most of the case, and we ultimately need to understand that and just build from first principles thinking, and ultimately just saying, hey, if it's deeper than that, we need to make sure that we understand each and every single independent part and how that functions within each other for the greater system, so that we can then basically have full control and not have chaos all of the time. And saying, hey, a move that you can make is next time something breaks, go 3 levels deeper, saying, hey, asking questions. That's why I like to ask questions as well, of asking why, because probably by the third or fourth why, you ultimately understand what is at the root of the problem that you're having, because just asking why is super important. And saying, hey, you could even ask, what's upstream of this issue, what's actually broken. So upstream, saying, hey, what is the upstream of this issue, what is above it, and then ultimately saying, hey, we need to make sure that we understand what's above it, what's below it, and what's below that as well. And ultimately just saying, hey, this solution that we're building out is based on XYZ, because we understand it at its core fundamental, and we have control over that. And one of the things that I have had, or that I have realized while building things, is that you need to maintain control in terms of what it is that you're having in terms of chaos, because without control, you ultimately don't have leverage. You don't have leverage if you don't have control. If you don't have control of your entire system, how do you expect it or you to build from it? And ultimately just understanding from its root ultimately helps you unlock that level of awareness that ultimately makes you make sure that you understand it and you're able to build from it. And then saying, hey, the third point, which is super important as well, is burn plus rebuild, rewrite to scale. Saying why this matters. Patching gets you through the week. I think this is a bit touchy, but yeah, saying patching gets you through the week, rewriting gets you through scale, making sure that, hey, each and every single part, if you want to scale, you ultimately need to rewrite. Although it's a long process and things need to be quick, ultimately making sure that, hey, patching gets you through the week. Ultimately, your solution or the problems that we're facing, so most of the times it's done through patchwork, to say, hey, we've seen so many people do patchwork and it's lasted or it's worked for some time, but as you reach a new level of scale, that's not going to cut it. It's simply not going to cut it, simply because you don't understand the system from its core. And I don't want to do that. And I always try to encourage the team to make sure that we understand this as well, and saying, hey, complex problems don't need duct tape, they need architecture. So if you have complex problems or you have complex data relationships and also dependencies, you don't need duct tape. You need to make sure that you're architecting a solution that ultimately fits your business and fits what it is that you're actively solving for as well, which is super important. And that's why I say my move on this is one of our connection automation. So our connections automation was not working, so booking client alert loops, so that alert loop was not working as it should, so it was a bit clunky, so we didn't understand what was going on because it wasn't firing the triggers of the webhooks that we were running. And then ultimately just asking, hey, what can we do, about this? So basically I nuked it, rewrote the logic their tree from scratch, making sure that, hey, we understand the logic that if xyz results in this, and then xyz and then yxz results like this, then it should function like this. But ultimately just then saying, hey, we need to just rebuild it from scratch, and that's okay. It may take a bit of time, but ultimately if we just get the result, that is the most important thing. And saying, hey, now it's scalable and I can plug into new inquiries in minutes. So now we just have that loop of saying, hey, if a new inquiry is fired or is filled in, it ultimately just fires into our system that we have built in minutes, and we don't have to stress about that anymore. Ultimately just knowing that, hey man, like, I think we're in a phase where I just feel like we can just build, man. Like, we can just build anything. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but I genuinely do believe that we can just build, and I know that we are just gonna build and just rip it. And I know that it's gonna take a bit of time, but I know into the future we're just gonna rip it, and we're just gonna continue building and solving problems. Because I think now the more and deeper I get into this, the more I realize that nothing is impossible. It just requires longer periods of time to just think things through and ultimately just build a solution. But enough of rambling about that and saying, hey, what's the lesson that I've learned? Good systems are simple on the surface, but brutal underneath. So making sure that, hey, although they're simple on the surface level, but they're brutal, man. They're absolutely brutal underneath. And saying sometimes you gotta burn it down to build it right. So sometimes you have to break everything in order to build it right. Just not focusing on patchwork and just making sure that you're building the solution from scratch, and that you're ultimately just crafting a solution that ultimately fits your business and your business needs, which I've personally found to be super important, especially with businesses that are scaling past a certain level. And saying, hey, a move that you can make is find the ugliest system, rewrite just one path, cleaner, leaner, and ready to scale. So just find the most ugliest part within your system, and then ultimately just rewrite it, and then make sure that it's cleaner, leaner, and ready to scale. And then saying, hey, why I am building different, which is something that I also ultimately just think about. And this is why most people build for now. I build for what's next. Ultimately, just saying, hey, I have this big picture vision, and I know for a fact that we're going to get there. And for the way that I like to think about things is systems are independent parts, but they all related to each other. And making sure that each and every single moving part is understood from first principles is ultimately just also first principles, and systems thinking is ultimately just going to allow us to build solutions that scale and that ultimately last into the long term. And I know that systems thinking is only just going to make sure that what it is that we're building, we ultimately understand it from its root fundamental and incorporate that with first principles thinking, which ultimately then allows us to solve complex problems, which is the thing that I wish I'd learned a lot sooner. But now that I'm learning it, I'm super pumped and super excited to just constantly just keep pushing the needle forward and saying, hey, for chaos that hasn't happened yet. So we're building for chaos that hasn't happened yet. We're building for scale that will break most ops, making sure that we're building for the level of scale that most ops break, and making sure that we're building custom solutions in this current present moment in time. Ultimately, just solving chaos within our team and also within our businesses that we are working with and our client base as well. And then saying, hey, for backend systems that don't blink when the pressure's on, because I know many people face a lot of problems, especially with the winnings events space, where they have vendor syncs and a lot of problems in terms of that, deadlines, and making sure that each and every person is aligned on the vision and the mission and what it is that you need to be doing, because you don't want to be going back and forth all or the whole time. You just want things to be streamlined and to be smooth, and that's what we're actively building for, and that's what we're also going to be building for when we move into different verticals. And I'm super excited for that. And saying, hey, one key question just to leave you guys off, which I think I should be doing each and every single video, just one question to just leave you off to think about, which is, what systems are you building right now that will survive if 100 clients hit tomorrow? So if you don't have clients, if you don't have 100 clients today, if you don't have clients at all today, and then you suddenly had 100 clients tomorrow, what is the system that will ultimately allow you to then survive having 100 clients that you could build today? Is it streamlining your onboarding process? Is it making sure that fulfillment is down on lock? Is it making sure that, hey, we need to make sure that our systems and processes within our SOPs ultimately allow us to survive that level of scale, and then ultimately building from that, but also taking into consideration systems thinking will ultimately just get you through the line of saying, hey, I need to make sure that I'm taking a systems thinking approach of saying each and every single moving part is independent, but they're all functions of a greater moving part, which is the entire system, and then ultimately just building a solution around that, and ultimately just understanding that, hey, the entire system, although it's the big picture vision, if you will, it ultimately has independent parts that need to communicate and also relate to each other based on dependencies and also just deep level problem solving, which ultimately allows you to then build a solution that lets you survive 100 clients if they hit tomorrow. So just building on this, I think this is super important. I'm super pumped to even think about systems thinking. I wish I'd learned it a lot sooner, and I wish that, before I had taken more of an approach to learning it, but now that I have, I'm super pumped to be sharing this and just to be building cool things with cool people at the same time, and just actively just solving deep rooted problems. But I know just solving problems is not enough. It requires a lot of frameworks, mental models, and ways and approaches to think about things and ultimately just solve things. And that's what I'm diving deep into, just learning a lot more, just taking that approach of saying, hey, I'm a lifelong learner and I'm just going to keep ripping it until the day we reach the end goal, and making sure that each and every single day we are hitting the nail in the wall and just creating leverage and just moving the needle forward each and every single day. And that is why we are building through systems thinking, and how that is actively tying into complex problem solving with first principles basis thinking as well. And I may make a separate video on this, but yeah, we'll just see. So day 39, I'm super excited. We're pumping up to 100. We're pumping it up to 100. So let's go. If you guys want to connect with me, make sure to leave a comment. Check me out on X if you just want to connect as well, X, Instagram, and yeah, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.